Hello, and welcome to the Great Composers Podcast, Episode 9, The Life of Ludwig van Beethoven, Part 1, A Distant Mirror. Dark caverned hour, the hand with fire's help did mold. High in the belfry of the tower, there will our story loud be told. Still will it last as years are tolling, and many ears will it inspire, and wail with mourners in consoling, and harmonize devotion's choir. What here below to sun terrestrial the ever-changing fate doth bring, doth strike the crown which made from metal, uplifting it doth sound its ring. Beethoven, a name meaning either the beet garden or improved land, or possibly even referring to a Flemish city in Brabant. Beethoven, a rather common name for rather common people. People for whom the glories and riches that fame and nobility could provide were but a distant dream. Though the family tree can be traced back a few hundred years from the time of our great composer, the firmest records of the Beethoven family which produced him only date back to the end of the 17th century, with our Beethoven's great-grandfather Michael. Born in 1684 to a man named Cornelius von Beethoven, about whom we know very little, Michael von Beethoven was a baker by trade who began his career in much the same fashion as other artisans of his time. He was first apprenticed to a master baker in 1700, achieving that rank himself in 1707. The great biographer Maynard Solomon tells us that after 1707, Michael von Beethoven worked on the side as something of a merchant, selling laces, paintings, and furniture, and also working in real estate. In these various capacities, as baker and as miscellaneous businessman, Michael initially had a great deal of success, which lasted for many years. His success until this point was not only financial, however, as he and his wife Mary eventually had 4 sons. Sadly, only 2 of these boys survived: Cornelius, a chandler and court purveyor by trade, and the first Beethoven to live in the Beethovenian city of Bonn, and his younger brother by 4 years, Ludwig van Beethoven, the first to possess that great name, and the man who was to be the idol of our great composer, and perhaps the only person that he ever truly worshipped without reservation. As was then the custom, the elder Ludwig van Beethoven was baptized several days following his birth on January 5, 1712, in the small town of Malines in Belgium. Ludwig, like his monumentally famous grandson, was put on the path towards a musical career at an early age, and eventually became a musician of great stature and someone who our great composer Beethoven held in exceedingly high esteem. Ludwig entered the choir school at the St. Rambaud Church in Malines at the age of 5, and continued to study there until 1725, when he began taking lessons on the organ from the church organist Antoine Kolff. These organ studies with Kolff naturally led to studies in the basic rules of composition and music theory. Oftentimes, this meant learning to accompany instruments or voices on the keyboard, as well as the realization of harmony through the reading of figured bass, an essential skill for anyone wishing to pursue a music career in the late Baroque period. Included in the course of study, which was paid for by his father, Ludwig was expected to substitute at the organ at the master's discretion without recompense. Similar in practice to other artisan trades, little Ludwig was essentially apprenticed to his master Kolff, who expected him to help in the musical chores as a part of his course of study, with no expectation of ever getting paid. In this, one recalls the scenes of Bach's children, pupils, and wife, all pitching in to get cantata scores prepared and copied, in the rush to meet the punishing performance schedule imposed on them by their teacher, and learning the craft of composition at the same time. After finishing his studies with Kolff, the elder Ludwig was a thoroughly trained musician, and began to be used as a performer and accompanist in several churches around town. The great amount of practical experience he gained for himself at his various public appearances helped Ludwig establish a reputation as a highly competent musician, a reputation which he would carry with him until the very end. After this period of what we might call freelancing in the churches of many-steepled Malines, Ludwig landed a position as choir director at the Church of St. Pierre in Louvain, and then was a short time later given a job as a bass singer at the Cathedral of St. Lambert in Liège. From here, Ludwig's career took off, and in 1733 he was invited by Clemens August, Archbishop of Cologne and Bishop of Liège, to join his musical retinue at his private court in Bonn. Ludwig's elder brother, Cornelius, had already taken up residence in Bonn in 1731, and the now reunited brothers were to make that city the Beethoven family seat for the next several decades. After becoming established in Bonn, the elder Ludwig started a very successful wine business, which provided a good source of extra income for the family, and, as we will see, also became the source from which many a Beethoven could slake their thirst. In Bonn, the first Ludwig flourished, and his talents were used in a variety of capacities. He was later described by his fellow townsmen as being a short, muscular man with extremely animated eyes, greatly respected as an artist. His excellent bass voice, along with his competent keyboard skills, were put to use in musical productions for the church, as well as for the opera house. As Jan Swafford tells us, Bonn's first Ludwig van Beethoven became a fixture at the palace, where music had a long history as part of the splendor of the electoral court. Bonn's electoral court was the seat of the Archbishop of Cologne, the aforementioned Clemens August. Despite being a small provincial town comfortably nestled on the west bank of the Rhine, Bonn had enormous importance as a political center within the Holy Roman Empire. The empire, which of course was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, had long been more of a loose confederation of petty principalities rather than a solid block of states, which maintained tenuous ties to the rulers who possessed the overblown title of emperor. These small, independent principalities took enormous pride in their local culture and history, oftentimes sporting their own local traditional dress, eating their own special culinary delicacies, and drinking their own local vintages of wine. Music was everywhere, claimed the Napoleonic critic and writer Madame de Staël. All in all, Bonn was a pleasant city in a comfortably out-of-the-way place, a hideaway suitable to an easygoing provincial lifestyle, a place largely ignorant of the trends of the Enlightenment, and resistant to the fluctuations of political thought and fortune which so plagued other parts of contemporary Europe. In his capacity as elector, Clemens August was a powerful man who was one of only 7 men of equal rank who had the privilege of voting for the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, centered on the formidable little town of Vienna. In his capacity as a high-ranking nobleman, Clemens August spent lavishly in an attempt to surround himself with the material glory he imagined his noble stature entitled him to. Then, as now, patronage of the arts was a way to put one's wealth and cultural sophistication on display. It was fortunate then for Ludwig that in Clemens August he had an employer who maintained a deep love for music, and someone who was willing to spend huge sums of money in support of it. Similar to other rulers, such as his contemporary Frederick the Great of Prussia, Clemens was trained to some extent in music. As a child, he was sent to study at the Jesuit school in Rome, where music was naturally on the curriculum. He took to his musical studies with some zeal, and in time, little Clemens was to become a proficient viola da gamba player. Still again, like many of the elite rulers of the era, Clemens preferred to spend time with his hobbies rather than with his work, and efforts towards the constant pursuit of pleasure robbed him of the time needed to govern his realm effectively. Throughout the course of his career, Clemens August had been awarded many positions for which he, by modern standards at least, was woefully underqualified. Jan Swafford sums up the career of the elector by saying that, in each of his exalted posts, Clemens August was splendidly brainless and incompetent, not in the least interested in governing anything. Continuing on to say that, as elector in Bonn, his attention would be given largely to pleasure in the form of ladies, music, dancing, and erecting monuments to his glory and munificence. Of all his various vices, it was dancing which would prove most fatal to the elector. Despite his flaws, Clemens August's patronage of the arts was a major factor in Bonn's emergence as an important musical center in the region, which was able to draw on a great deal of provincial talent, such as the first Ludwig van Beethoven himself and Johann Ries, father of one of our Beethoven's violin teachers, and grandfather to the composer's student Ferdinand Ries, who will figure prominently in our story later on. The orchestra Clemens maintained during his reign was steadily becoming known as one of the most prestigious ensembles in the western part of the empire, rivaling the great orchestral powerhouse of Mannheim, run by Johann Stamitz and his family. The Bonn Orchestra drew on a repertoire of Italian and French operas, ballets, and concert music, thereby providing the glamorous court and its ruler with ample and diverse entertainments. In addition to bolstering the musical position of the city, Clemens August was a great builder who transformed Bonn from a pleasant and beautiful backwater town on the Rhine into an electoral capital whose architectural achievements and artistic life were worthy of its ruler's high position within the Holy Roman Empire. Throughout much of his long reign, which lasted from 1724 until 1761, Clemens August oversaw a period of great prosperity in Bonn. Wealth flowed into the court, which employed the vast majority of the town's citizens in numerous and probably redundant positions, such as lackey, window cleaner, fowl plucker, baker, cook, and musician. In his pursuit of glamour and prestige, Clemens racked up huge debts, which he did little to come to terms with during his rule, and even less to eliminate. The cost of his opera productions by themselves reached 50,000 thalers, or 75,000 florins a year, which is a staggering amount when we consider that Old Man Bach's salary in Leipzig during roughly the same time period hovered around 700 thalers per year, and rarely ever reached as high as 1,000 with his added extra income. All of this is to say that when the elder Ludwig arrived in Bonn to take up his position at the electoral court, things were going pretty good. In the years following his arrival in Bonn, Ludwig steadily became one of the city's most important musicians, eventually achieving the coveted title of Kapellmeister in 1761, which had a hefty salary attached to it. Remarkably for a Kapellmeister of this time, and in the context of his later family history, the elder Ludwig was no composer. This was in some ways a fortunate omission in his talents, because a Kapellmeister at this time was worked incessantly and called on to produce new music at their employer's whim and to their specified order. A very tiresome way of life, and one that not everyone was suited to, especially someone like our great composer, whose future still lay before us. The great achievements of the elder Ludwig were later to become a great influence on Beethoven, who always held his grandfather in high esteem, and as the epitome of what it was to be a musician of foremost stature. According to Maynard Solomon, Beethoven's admiration for his grandfather bordered on hero worship. His desire to emulate the Kapellmeister remained with him throughout his life. Beethoven's lifelong quest was to achieve the same great success that his grandfather had attained, and he always kept close to his heart an ambition to become the Kapellmeister at a great court. For various reasons, this was something that the grandson of Ludwig was never able to achieve. The immense praise that Beethoven showered on the memory of his grandfather is due in large part to the loathsome one he held for his namesake's son. With his great psychological insight, Maynard Solomon tells us that it was only natural that Beethoven should strive to emulate the Kapellmeister, who had been the most powerful force in Bonn's musical life. It is worth noting, however, that a strong psychological identification with the grandfather may well go hand in hand with the repudiation of his father by idealizing a male grandparent. Recollections of the grandfather's talent, position, and power contrasted painfully with the father's hapless mediocrity. This man, our Beethoven's father, would be remembered by later generations as one of the great parental tyrants of music history, pushing and punishing his boy relentlessly in the quest for musical fame. In time, our Beethoven was to become rather delusional about his childhood recollections, a habit he cultivated in many areas of life, allowing rumors to circulate for many years that he was in fact the son of Frederick the Great of Prussia. Ironically, this same rejection of his paternity also was a slander on the honor of his mother, someone who the composer loved dearly. In mid-September of 1733, shortly after arriving in Bonn, the elder Ludwig married Maria Josepha Pohl, a rather tragic figure from whom we can trace the roots of the family affliction of alcoholism, a disease which cost her dearly later in life, as she would be banished to a cloister in Munich for the last 20 years of that life, ending her days as a secluded, neglected, and forgotten member of the family. Contemporaries of our Beethoven were well aware of his admiration for the elder Ludwig, but what they must have also been aware of was the fact that the great composer was silent on the subject of his afflicted grandmother, never once mentioning her name or even hinting at her existence. Beethoven evidently harbored a deep fear of the alcoholism which so plagued his family and so often threatened its very existence. As a result, he felt nothing for and had little to say about those who were its victims. Our Beethoven's character drew on many of the family's worst habits and characteristics, which in time grew to include this very same affliction. Towards the end of his life, our weary and depressed composer would drown his sorrows in the family's favorite beverage, sending himself down the very same path of self-destruction so well trodden by his father and grandmother. But before that tragedy comes our way, the first of many, seemingly happier things were in the make. The elder Ludwig and his new wife had 3 children, of which only our Beethoven's father Johann survived. Little Johann von Beethoven was born sometime in the year of 1740 in Bonn. Yet another tragic figure in a family full of them, Johann was destined to be everything his father Ludwig was not. Forced into the same trade as his father, Johann repeatedly fell off the ladder of success and proved to be a disappointment to his demanding and cruel parent. Johannes der Läufer, Ludwig called his son, Johann the runner, Johann the sprinter, always running from responsibility and away from the necessities of life. The elder Ludwig was once overheard saying to his son, "You keep running. Someday you'll run to your grave." The one quality that all 3 of our Beethovens shared in equal measure was that they were abhorrent and utterly terrible fathers. Throughout his childhood, little Johann was witness to violent confrontations between his overly proud father and troubled mother. These sad family scenes would play themselves out over and over again in generation after generation of Beethovens, and be one of the plagues of our great composer's life. In his position as the only male child, Johann von Beethoven was expected to follow his father into the musical trade. In doing so, Johann could be confident that someday he would be able to attain a nice position at court, and then go on to enjoy a life as a comfortably well-off family man. So the decision to train him as a musician was a sound one. As a boy, Johann was first schooled at the Jesuit college in Bonn, where he, like his future son Ludwig, proved to be less than a success. Subjects like math were never a particular specialty of this line of Beethoven. No matter, though, Johann was soon taught by his father to sing and play the violin and piano. He then became an unpaid member of the choir as a boy soprano at age 12, and as his voice developed and matured, he slowly wound his way down to the lower vocal range of tenor. The boy served the choir for another 12 years as an unpaid singer, and finally received, through the intervention of his father, the rather pitiful salary of 150 florins in 1764. The fact that Johann remained an unpaid singer for so long, until he was 24 years old, is outrageous, especially when we consider the fact that the elder Ludwig had become court Kapellmeister in 1761, a position that put him at the very top of the musical establishment in Bonn, and one that no doubt provided him with a direct line to the archbishop's ear. The promotion of the elder Ludwig to the position of Kapellmeister was the direct result of the death of his royal patron, Clemens August, and the accession of his successor, Maximilian Friederich. Clemens August, who had so early on recognized Ludwig's talent and potential, ended his days in the same glorious way he had lived them. While on a trip to Munich, in the year of Ludwig's glory 1761, Clemens fell gravely ill and had to limp into the nearby town of Ehrenbreitstein, unable to eat or do much of anything else. Regretfully, however, that same evening there was a ball in the local elector's palace, and the fun-loving Clemens could not bear to let the court ladies go without an opportunity to dance with his holy person. This dance was to be his last, and while honoring the ladies with the graceful spectacle of his balletic skill, he suddenly sank to the floor, cast down by the same illness which had brought him to the ball in the first place. By the next morning, the glorious Clemens was no more, and it was rightfully said of him that he had danced his way out of this life and into some other. The death of Clemens meant the death of a long line of Bavarian electors in Bonn, as well as the fun-loving and wondrous atmosphere that the city had basked in for the last several decades. It was said at the time that, with Clemens August, one wore blue and white. Then one lived as in paradise. With Max Friederich, one wore black and red, and suffered hunger and may as well be dead. The zeal for spending, which was so much a part of the life of Clemens, was met in Max Friederich by an equal zeal for saving. This naturally meant that positions at court, so coveted by the citizens of Bonn, were slashed, and money-saving measures were put into place throughout the electorate. The change in the electoral regime was not all bad, however, and the Beethoven family was one that benefited greatly from it. The power behind Max Friedrich's throne was a man named Caspar Anton von Belderbusch, who was to become a major supporter of all things Beethoven, and was a key player in establishing the elder Ludwig in his position as Kapellmeister. For most of his life, Johann was firmly under the thumb of his father. What the elder Ludwig never realized was that Johann der Läufer was not running from the responsibility of his work. He was really running from his father. The oppressive nature of his father and the often violent criticisms leveled at him sent Johann wide afield, searching for some sort of relief, a search that more often than not had terrible results. The elder Ludwig's oppression of his son even spread to the boy's love life, and it was here that Johann thought he could finally find a way to escape the Kapellmeister. Shortly after his being hired as a salaried member of the choir, Johann began casting about for a wife. He set his sights on a girl from a nearby town named Maria Magdalena Lem, who had by the age of 18 already buried a husband and a child. Jan Swafford says of Johann at this time that he was a passably handsome man, with strong features and broad shoulders, sociable and full of Lebenslust in the way of Rhinelanders, and he sported a repertoire of songs that he sang and played on the keyboard and fiddle and zither. Of Maria he tells us that she was slender, blonde, and pretty, though her face was serious and over the years only became more so. The two were soon engaged, and upon hearing this news from his son, the elder Ludwig flew into a rage. He imagined that Maria was not a suitable match for Johann, explaining that, "I never expected you to stoop so low." The reasons for Ludwig's resistance to the match are hard to ascertain, but it seems that since Maria's father had died while she was still young, and that she had already been widowed, she had nothing to offer the family, and was well beneath the dignity of a Kapellmeister's son. At the same time, Maria's family, led by her formidable mother, was equally unenthusiastic about the match, and they too did not approve of having Johann as a family member. Though furious, Ludwig gave his tacit acceptance to the arrangements, and the marriage of Johann von Beethoven and Maria Magdalena Lem was on, taking place in Bonn on November 12, 1767. Little did anyone know that this was a union which through all its unhappy years would one day produce one of the world's greatest artists and most consequential human beings. The wedding, which normally would have taken place in the bride's hometown, must have been a very unhappy occasion. The groom's father very reluctantly agreed to attend, only doing so on the condition that the whole affair was kept short. Whatever happiness there was in all of this lasted no longer than the wedding did. Shortly after the marriage, it is speculated that Johann either was given as a dowry or outright swindled his mother-in-law out of close to $300, nearly all of the woman's life savings. After losing her daughter to yet another ill-starred marriage, and then losing all of the money she had spent a lifetime hiding away, Maria's mother suffered a complete mental breakdown. She was dead within a year of her daughter's union with Johann. Over the years, this sad and ill-fated couple would have 7 children, of whom only 3 sons survived. Maria seems to have instantly regretted her attachment to Johann, and regarded her marriage as a chain of sorrows. She was later known for the depressing advice she would give to the young ladies whom she knew, saying, "How thoughtlessly so many young people get married without knowing what sorrows await them," going further to say that one should weep when a girl is brought into the world. And so we have our portrait of the family, and have laid the scene into which the younger Ludwig van Beethoven, greatest of all composers, was born. Though at times the Beethovens could be loving, and could at least be superficially happy, this was a family that suffered deeply at each other's hands, and for whom tragedy was second nature. As the next generation of Beethovens came into being, the chain of sorrows will be added to, and the sons of Johann would find in themselves the same distressing habits which had so troubled the preceding generations, though with them these traits were magnified to a far greater extent than any ever thought possible.